Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Western Australian Museum's Virtual Lab program. In this program, we get to take a peek behind the scenes at some of the work that our scientists and curators do. Before we get started, please ensure that your video and your microphone stay off through the entire session. We would also like to acknowledge that this presentation is being held on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people and pay our respects to their leaders, past, present, and future. With us today, we have Dr. Kenny Travouillon, who works in the terrestrial zoology department studying mammals. So hello, Kenny, and welcome. And can you tell us a little bit about your role at the museum here?
Thanks for having me. So my role is pretty eclectic. My major part of my work is research and discovering new species of mammals. So I've got the collection here that I'm able to peruse, and I can look through and see if there's any unrecognized species in the collection. And then once I've discovered a new species, I get to describe it, name it, and then I publish a paper about it. And then it gets published in a journal that's available for the world to see. And then that's how you discover a new species. But that's only one part of my work. I also have to do public inquiries. So if anyone in WA has a question, they found a bone on their property and they want to know if it's what mammal it could belong to, they can email the museum, and then the question comes to me, and then I look at the photos and then identify the bone and say, oh, it's come from a fox, or it come from a possum, and so on. And so I answer all the questions for the public in that way. Also, I will take care of the collections, so making sure they're kept for the future, organized, so we can, a bit like a library, so it's a library of life. Every species is organized, so you can actually find all the specimens from a species very easily. And so if a researcher wants to come and work on the collection, they can easily access it.
We have some of them behind us here too,
yeah.
Joining us today.
And we have two different types of collection items. We have things like this, which are more for display. And then we have research material that's more for research, obviously. And the last part of my work is obviously the new museum that is opening tomorrow. Is basically help putting the galleries together to tell stories about the wildlife in WA.
Excellent. And how did you first become interested in studying mammals?
I grew up in France, and my parents decided to move to Australia. And already at that point, I was interested in animals. So I went to university and did a zoology degree. And at that point in time, I didn't know exactly what sort of research I wanted to do. I was interested in animal behavior as well as in evolution. And it just fell into place that I chose to do honors in paleontology, which was more on the evolution side. So that's studying fossils of mammals. So that was exciting. And then I loved it so much, I continued on with a PhD afterwards. And got to work on a really amazing site called Riversley in Northern Queensland, which was basically the site that really tells all about the evolution of marsupials in Australia. So it was pretty amazing. And then from that on, I continued, got a job at University of Queensland to continue studying my fossils. So I studied fossil bandicoots and kangaroos and described a number of species during that project. And then from there, got the job here as curator of mammals.
Excellent. Did you have a favorite mammal when you were younger, or?
Yeah, I was. So I came actually to Australia on a holiday first before moving here. And as soon as I got to Australia, I fell in love with koalas. And I really wanted to actually study them in the future. But in the end, there was too many people working on koalas. So if I wanted to have a job, I would have to like work on a different type of mammal. So I chose to work on bandicoots and kangaroos that less people were working on.
Yeah, well, we definitely have a lot of interesting mammals in Australia and in Western Australia particularly as well to study it. So you do have lots of options.
Yes.
So what does your work actually entail? So when you're doing your research, can you walk through a little bit as to what that actually looks like?
Yeah, so I might be coming in the morning and use the collections. So going through, I might grab a few skulls to measure to check. So I brought a skull and a calipers. So I might take some measurements on the skull. I might take the measurements of like the length of the skull, the width of the skull, lots of measurements all around the teeth, all the different parts on the inside of the skull as well. And this informed us a lot about the shape of the skull, and that will be different between species. So once you have all these measurements, you can analyze it, and then you can work out whether you have two clouds, and therefore you have two species, or if you have three clouds, or maybe you have only one cloud. There's what you thought was two species, actually just the one. So I think that doing that research really helps make a decision whether you have more than one species.
And you were using an item there, called a caliper. So you wouldn't just use a ruler. And why is that?
Because this is a lot more precise. So it gives you in millimeters. So that here you can read 6.34. So it goes down to 2 digits after the millimeter. So it's a lot more precise. And for very small things, that's how precise you want to be, because it might be a difference between 6.1 and 6.9, might be a big difference between two species that you're looking at. So that's why you have to be very precise with your measurements. So that's one thing that's working in the collection, but another part would be to go in the fields and collect animals. So you might actually trap some animals and then measure them in the collect some tissues, so you can do a DNA analysis, and also prepare specimens for the collections. There's also lab work. So if we, let's say someone brings in a roadkill of an animal, we can then process that in the lab. So we might skin the animal, so we can prepare that skin so it be kept long term. So it's prepared with chemicals to make sure that the skin doesn't go off and doesn't mold or anything like that. And then the skeleton is prepared separately. We actually use museum beetles to prepare the skeleton. So we'll give the carcass to the beetles, and they'll slowly eat all the flesh and basically clean it down to the bone. And then that's then ready for to put in the collection. And then that skeleton can be used for research.
You have to know a lot of different, it sounds like maths, and you have to know a little bit of chemistry and all these different areas as well to do what you do. And
you don't necessarily learn all of these skills that you need. A lot of it you learn on the job or by volunteering. A lot of people come to museum, volunteer, learn the skills, and then after that they apply for a job. And because they already have the skills, they have a better chance. Yeah, I think that's all. I've covered everything there.
And so when you go out into the field, I want to know, so how do you catch an animal? I'm assuming you're not just wandering around, do you actually set up traps?
So actually, part of my research, I was actually researching how people used to do it back in the 1800s, when like the British arrived in Australia. They saw all these animals. Did they just catch them like by running after them? Actually, Aboriginal people actually helped them because they had the knowledge of the land. They knew how to find the animals. They knew how to catch them. And the early naturalists, they were called, that were interested in discovering new species. They actually would, during the day, catch with their indigenous guide on the landscape. They would find the animals, and then after that, they would prepare the animal. And then the leftovers would be eaten around the fire with the locals. And so that would be like the thank you for helping us find this animal. We get to all share a meal together. These days, we don't do that anymore. But the trapping is done usually with cages. It depends on what sort of things you want to catch. But a medium-sized mammal you would do in a cage. And you do idiot traps, which are smaller for smaller mammal. Or you can do pit traps as well, so they fall into a hole.
how do you entice them to come into those traps?
We put a little bowl of peanut butter yeah, and oats into the trap, and they basically they smell the bait. They go inside, they get trapped in there, and in the morning, because we want to pick up the get them out of the trap before it gets hot. In the morning, we check the traps, get them out, and so they're okay. They're not suffocating in there in the heat. So that's how we trap animals.
Excellent. And I think a lot of the work that you just discussed, what you do, and even taking the measurements and everything, that's all to sort of look at the differences between different species as well. And you do a lot of taxonomic work, which our viewers might know if they're studying classification or anything like that, of how to sort of differentiate species. What's involved in this, and why do you love doing that sort of work?
Well, it's really important actually. We know what species we have, because otherwise you can't conserve. You don't know what's threatened. You don't know what's going extinct. If we really understand how many species exist in the wild, and we have names for them, then we can go to the next step of actually working out what's the population of that species, and then monitor that population over time. If it's going down, then we can we intervene and try to protect it. If it's going up, all good. But you need to have that naming first before you can do anything. So when you hear stories about introduction of for the first time of a species into in a state where it was extinct, all this is known because of that early research that was done. So it's really important to have that taxonomic knowledge first, how many species we have, and then you can go to the next steps of conserving species so we can protect them from extinction.
It's almost like building up so that we have, the more information we have, the better we actually know what's going on.
Yeah, and sometimes it happens that we can find that an animal's been translocated in an area and then realize later on actually the species that was living there actually was a different species. Therefore, the translocation was not really any use because it's a different species altogether.
So it can definitely inform policies and what we're doing to actually see that it is working. So a lot of the work that you do is actually looking back at species within the collections and finding out more about sort of species that lived a while ago or even are now extinct. So can you tell me a little bit about that work?
Yeah, so because my background was first in paleontology, fossils, so I looked a lot on, I was working a lot with bones, but now with in my position, I'm working more on modern mammals, and so I have to go through the collection and try and find species that are that haven't been discovered. But I'm finding that actually a lot of the species I'm discovering in the collections are often species that are already extinct. And it's thanks to the collection of these in the past that we are discovering these species actually ever existed. So, so it's a very sad, and I think one of the pictures that is going to be going on the screen eventually is a species of pig-footed bandicoot that I looked at in Paris. And that particular one, so pig-footed bandicoot was originally one species, and it was to be everywhere, basically in the arid zone of Australia. And once I was looking for the collections, I realized there were actually probably more than one species. I traveled across the world to look at all the specimens. So there's only about 29 specimens of pig-footed bandicoots. So there's not many, and they're scattered everywhere. So I had to travel to Europe, to America, to actually to look at that.
That's like a great opportunity to go and find all that.
It's great if you can get the funding, and then you basically examine all the specimens and try to work out. And so the specimen that I was shown was is in Paris, and I was actually collected in the center of Australia on an expedition by Charles Sturt. And it's the very first one ever collected of that species. And then it was a new species that we only named last year. And so we, in that process, worked out there was 2 species of pig-footed bandicoot instead of 1.
Yeah, so even just looking back on, when they collected these specimens, they didn't know that it might actually be really useful in the future. So the more, I guess the more information we get, whether it's measurements out in the field or whether it's keeping the specimens for future research, museums can play a really important role. So
yeah. The sad thing of discovering new species that are extinct is we keep adding to the number of species that have gone extinct in Australia. And already Australia has the worst record for mammal extinction in the world. We have over 30 species that have gone extinct since Europeans arrived in Australia. and then I keep finding new ones. So in a few years' time, we may have reached 40 because of all the new discoveries, and which is very sad because we've lost a lot of animals.
Yes, we're finding out more information, but unfortunately finding out animals that we may never get to see. But
Yes.
at least we can have samples of them in the collection as well.
Yeah.
So what are some of the unique challenges? I imagine there's a few different interesting things doing research on extinct animals that no longer exist within. So what are some of the unique challenges with that?
So as I said before, one of the challenges is because when something goes extinct, you can't go and collect it anymore. So you have to rely on collections that I've done in the past. And a museum like the Western Australian Museum doesn't have everything. And you may have to actually go to travel to other museums to get enough information. So traveling across the world is costly, and not everyone can afford to do that. So you have to apply for grants to do this sort of work. So I was lucky enough to be able to do that with a Churchill Fellowship sponsored by the ABRS. And that was allowing me to do that research. The other thing is these specimens are very old, but we still can recover DNA out of them. So we can get a bit of belly skin out of like a very old bilby. I think that's one that's going to be on the screen. So that was in London. There was one of the very old bilbies that was collected in the 1800s, and got a bit of skin, send it to a lab to get DNA extracted, and then we can actually work out how it is related to the other bilbies that we have. And then you can actually then discover if any of those specimens in museum collections are different species or not.
That sounds like definitely some challenges, but it sounds like with DNA and things like that, it actually might make it a little bit easier as well to confirm things with limited data points. So
in the past, we had morphology, which basically studying the shape of bones and or the color of skins, and that's all we had. Now with DNA, we have a second tool to work out species. And so when you have both morphology and DNA tells you the same story, then you're very confident that that you have done the right thing, that you've got the right number of species, you have not named the right species. So having the two data sets is really important.
And has much sort of changed in sort of your career in terms of how you do this work?
Well, I haven't been doing the work as long as some of the other curators in the museum. So not much has changed. Like instead of DNA, yes, every year there's new techniques. There's a lot more you can do. We can extract more information from the DNA. But otherwise, we still really use a lot of traditional techniques. So things that people were doing 200 years ago, we'll still do it today. We're still measuring skulls. We're still looking at skins. And so we're doing a lot of the old techniques as well as using the new techniques. So a bit of a nice mix.
And it might be as well a little bit easier to communicate between different museums. I don't know what you might have had to do in the past to know what they had, but as we have here, you have sort of the life library, as you say, like they might have their collections more available that way.
Yeah, now a lot of museums are moving to having a digital collection. So they have pictures of every items on their website. We don't have that just yet here, but maybe that's something for the future to have. And so researchers can actually almost like already visit the collection virtually and see what they need to see. Obviously, that doesn't replace having the specimen in hand, but it might actually help the person plan their trip. They know like, oh, I need to see this specimen and this specimen and this one. It'll take me 3 days, so I'll book for a trip to 3 days. It helps massively. Then if you send a list of names with no pictures, it's a bit harder to know really what's the state of the specimen and make a decision.
Like an online wish list for online shopping for all your mammal needs.
Yes, and now when you want to just go through and just look at pictures.
You could probably get like lost in looking at all these digital collections in different museums. That would have been definitely a good activity to do over the past 6 months or so. So the new museum is opening tomorrow. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the work that you've done in putting together sort of like some of the collections there and what we might find when we get to go in.
Yeah, so the new museum, so it's called Bull Barret, and it's got many stories. So with the mammals also, there's lots of you want to see like a big mammal gallery like the museum used to have, it will be, mammals will be a bit everywhere, and it will be depending on the story that we're telling. So for example, in the wildlife gallery, that's where you're going to see most of the mammals. You'll have a section on the mammals of the southwest of WA. So you'll see a showcase showing all the different mammals you can see. And you'll probably recognize some of them because they're quite familiar to most people in WA. But others you might not realize actually in your garden, and you just never, they live, they're nocturnal animals, they come out at night, they're small, you never would have thought they would be there. We're talking a little bit, also there's a section on the numbat, which is our state emblem, and talking about its conservation because it's endangered. There's also a section on digging mammals, how they actually dig fungus on the forest floor, and actually spread some of the fungal spores, and therefore they're good for the environment. Then you might go to another section, and that's the one I've been working the most on, is the extinct mammal showcase. And I think there's going to be a picture as well showing about some of the mammals that are going to go on display. So the extinct mammals of WA are shown with actually the timeline on display of when they actually went extinct. So you can see first in the 1800s, there were a few going extinct, but wasn't too bad just yet. And then as you approach the 1950s, then you got a big amount of mammals going extinct. And then it stopped around the 1980s when the first efforts of conservation have really been put in place. And so we've stopped a lot of extinction because now we're doing something about it. So that showcase really shows you like where we've lost. And then opposite it, there's a section on mammals on islands that are being reintroduced on the mainland, and how there's a lot of efforts by organizations like DBCA to really save those species from extinction and try to reintroduce them to the mainland where they used to occur, and try to protect them. So that's some of the things that you can see. There's lots more. There's a blue whale skeleton that you have to go and see. You get to walk under it. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I think it's definitely well worth going to have a look at, especially seeing some of these really, like, you wouldn't get a chance to see some of these extinct species anywhere else, because they're unique to where we are. So it's a great opportunity. So before we go, I just wanted to go back a little bit to the skull. I want to show the camera a close up of just this skull, and so we get a chance to talk a little bit about sort of all the different data and things that we collect about it. I don't know if they can see a little bit.
Yeah, so that's a quenda. It's our local bandicoot species. And that's a male. And you can see it's a male as opposed to a female because it's got these big canines on the front. Can you see that on the camera, the big canines? So the males have that, those big canines, probably because they fight one another to get access to the females. The females don't fight each other, so they don't have to have big canines to bite each other.
And one more question about, so you've obviously had a lot of work, naming species, and what's your favorite story about naming a species?
All right, I've got one. So I worked on fossil bandicoots first, and every time I was talk to friends or anyone really about bandicoots, they go like, "What's a bandicoot?" Or if they knew what a bandicoot was, then you Crash Bandicoot the video game. And that's the only two responses I got, either nothing or Crash Bandicoot. So I ended up like, I need to name something after Crash Bandicoot because apparently that's the only Bandicoot that matters. And so I named one of the fossils Crash Bandicoot. So that's Crash is the genus and Bandicoot is the species name.
It sounds like an interesting different way of naming things. And one perk of your job is getting to sort of like put those little jokes in there. You've got to have fun, haven't you?
Yes.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us a little bit about the work that you do, sharing a little bit about what's going to be in the new museum Boulevard, which we hope to see you at. And thanks so much, and thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you very much.